the screen. Excellent, excellent. Welcome, Mickey. Thank you for joining. You are in the breakout room 3, financing professionalized maintenance. We're going to go ahead and get started here in just a minute, but we're going to wait until we have some more people joining us. Welcome, Rachel. Thank you for joining us. Looks like we have quite a few joining us here. Just giving a minute to click. Welcome, Emily. Thank you for joining us. Oh. So we're just going to take another minute or two to allow people to kind of come into the room. We have roughly 16 participants now joining us. So just a quick notification as we wait for more people to kind of join us, come out of Blue Jeans into this new platform on Zoom. This is the session on financing maintenance. It'll be with representatives from WAVE. And so just wanted to share some norms for this space. We wanted to offer this as an additional kind of way for you to engage with our guest speakers today. So please feel free to raise your hand. I will be here behind the scenes to help manage like any cues that kind of naturally happen from all the questions that you might have. And we still encourage you to limit your background noise, particularly since if you still have Blue Jeans open, we want to make sure that we don't have any strange backfeed. So if you do come off of mute or come on video to ask a question, just be aware of those situations. And then please be sure to tell us who you are within this space. Within Zoom, you can go ahead and edit your name so that we can see your first and last name. And even if you wanted to share the organization that you're affiliated from, and that will help us kind of call upon you. So we have roughly about 24 participants now. So I think we can go ahead and get started. We have some brief presentations and then really wanted to use this opportunity as a way for all of you to engage and speak. So with that, I'm going to go off mute and Rob, I believe you're up first.
Okay, many thanks, Katie, and thanks everybody for joining us. I think Adam and I will try and be succinct in our presentation so we leave adequate time for discussion. So I've got 6 slides here just to provide a bit of context. So if we just move straight on. So the first one is just really a little bit of landscaping, looking at the names in the room. I think you're all fairly familiar with this, so we need not dwell on it. We've seen the latest JMP figures. We can see where the world stands. We can see that Africa is becoming decoupled in many respects, and rural water is even further behind. So it's a major sort of policy question and area that needs addressing. In terms of how we face this and some of the questions we've had about financing, the figure on your left sort of makes conceptually the case that we need concessionary finance here. And I think Adam and I will both speak to this in terms of the need for subsidy and how you work out how that can be done effectively over time. So if we move to the next slide, one of the things that we've been thinking about through SWS, but sort of more broadly in terms of partnership with WAVE and other colleagues, is what is this funding gap? I mean, we say it, we can see the figures from Guy Hutton that comes out, but what does that actually mean in empirical terms for the costs of maintenance delivery? So this is through a consortium called Uptime with 5 partners working in Africa with data from 2015. So there's about 700 quarterly records. It's a very detailed record. And this is a paper that's coming out this month with Adam as a co-author on this, with other colleagues, looking at the approximate subsidy required. And it works out to be sort of slightly less than $1 per person per year. And it gives us a sort of at least a sense of what that number would be going forward. But you'll also see in the figure there's variation there depending whether it's pipe systems or oral hand pumps it does vary, and this is very helpful that we then have a better sense in terms of how we target the subsidy in a more effective way going forward. So if we move to the next slide. So we've been working in Kenya with our colleagues in FundiFix for many, many years now. We've been trying to look at this and trying to get a better sense of what the empirical data is. So I think Ella shared this slide at the beginning, and what this tries to pull together is some of the data that we've collated between what we understand community management performances in terms of repair times in days, and also in terms of percentage uptime between community and performance-based. And you can see there are, there's quite a difference between the two. And these have material benefits in terms of social and economic outcomes, as we know, particularly for women and girls that often bear the brunt of when these systems do not work. But it gives us a sense empirically, what is the case for this going forward. So if you move forward. So I've also been involved in something called the Water Services Maintenance Trust Fund, that when we set up FundiFix in 2015, 2016, we realized there would be a need for a subsidy. We'd realized that project finance is very ephemeral and quixotic, so it's very unsure whether you will get this. So we set up a trust fund in Kenya looking at this from 2016. And the way in which the model, and I don't know whether we've skipped a slide here, could you just check forward whether the order's been, there it is, yeah. So this is the trust fund logic, which is trying to understand or create a flexible funding modality that is available for the service provider going forward outside of project cycles, etc. Now, this is important in terms of some of the chat that people have talked about, willingness to pay and affordability issues. And if you are contracting with communities or schools and healthcare facilities, there's a moral obligation that you've got to provide these services over time, and you've got to make the money available. So this was part of the rationale of how we set it up. We set it up initially with research funds to sort of try and incubate it, and we were looking to sort of try and bring government into that, and that's had fairly slow progress on the government side. So if we go to the next one, here we go. Yeah, so I think I've already spoken about that. That gives you a sense of what the performance is. And this has been very important on a number of levels, that we've increasingly brought in non-donor finance into the trust fund over the 5 years that's been operating. And this includes a mining company in Kenya, an agricultural company, and more recently, an ethical retailer in Germany that's become interested in the work because we can provide clear, verifiable indicators of performance, and equally that the users, communities or schools, will pay some of the cost, not all of the cost, into the system, and that makes it a valuable proposition to this new type of funder. So if we move on to the next slide. So this gives some indication of how the profile of funding has changed over time. So when we started, it was largely donor funding that came into it. So it was sort of 80% that came into it. And what you can see over time is that we've managed to increase the level of funding by bringing other people into this system, which is very positive. I would sort of note, you can sort of see the change in users and payment levels. Progress has been made, but it's been sort of quite slow, I would sort of say, and it's not achieved significant scale. And this is why we've been working with Adam and other teams in Africa that's been doing similar work to see how we can learn from this and understand other scalable approaches going forward. So it's promising, I think, but it's, after 5 years, you think, what are the routes to sustainability and scale through this process? And then if we go to the final slide, I think, yeah, these are just some summary comments to wrap up. Firstly, I think bringing in professional maintenance with these types of contracts can work. It delivers very material benefits to water users. And this has occurred during drought events in Eastern Africa, and also the recent or the ongoing public health crisis through COVID, that these companies are delivering these services. So there's very strong economic and social benefits to this. Policy has changed, so we've been working with national and county governments, and they've been open to the idea, as the work of Adam and Wave in Uganda, in terms of being more inclusive about this, considering professionalized approaches going forward. But they often have limited capacities, and they're often very distracted by election cycles. So this is a work in progress. The thing to reflect upon is the fourth point, that since 2010, Kenya has a constitutional commitment, which the politicians find very difficult to do anything with, to the right to safe water. But in the 2019 census, roughly 1 in 4 people were saying they were using surface water. And in Kitui, where we do a lot of our work, that was as high as 40%. So there's, even with these sort of legal mandated commitments, the actual translation of that is slow. So the concluding point, I think this is a promising approach. I think it's far from complete, but it certainly needs stronger government commitments. That is essential. And there's also importance in terms of sector cooperation. It's something we try and work with our partners as much as we can, but it's something that I think we could all improve on going forward. So I'll pause there and hand it back to you, Katie.
Great, Rob, thank you. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions if anybody had one for you. We'll also reserve time towards after Adam's presentation to kind of harness any other kind of broader questions. But did want to kind of flag for your attention, Rob, we have a comment from Ryan Rowe here. Great to see the increase in non-donor interest. So I didn't know if you wanted to kind of elaborate on that or speak to that.
I mean, I suggest we let Adam speak, and then we can return to questions at the end.
Excellent. That sounds wonderful. So then maybe Adam, over to you.
Yeah, okay. Good day to everybody. I'll try and be brief. Thank you, Rob. That was great. And so we really do want to have time for questions. Now, I'll just run through a kind of script and try and be brief. I'm the managing director of Wave Solutions. We are an advocacy organization, as well as being a practical maintenance utility. And our real focus, right now today, is on how to finance WASH programs. One of the purposes of SWS, originally and now, is to sort of provide a bit of research outcome to WASH financing organizations like USAID and others. One of the things that is really important to see is that in Uganda, and I think Ella mentioned this earlier on, we have seen recently a national policy on operation and maintenance, a new one, a fresh one that moves away from community management dependency and moves towards professional maintenance. And it's very interesting point in development here in progress, because if this policy is successfully implemented, it does mean that 25 million people will start having safe water every day, which is a huge shift from the current problems we're having. So one of the things we've discovered is that there is confusion about how to finance. And if only we were all to agree on very simple cost definitions and categories, there would be much better progress and coordinated progress. So there are 4, in our sort of research conclusion is there are basically 4 categories of finance. You can see them on the screen. And of these 4, 2 of them are non-recurrent. Obviously, infrastructure investment is non-recurrent, but there is an important point to make. With a professional maintenance policy, infrastructure investment has to be funded in a different way from up to now. It has to be funded on the assumption that a maintenance structure is going to be established as a sort of prior condition of any construction or restoration of degraded infrastructure. And that is a huge shift in current practice by donors and by government. And this is really one very important conclusion for donors to take on board. If we move on now to system investment, it's also a non-recurrent cost, because what we're doing here is we're building a new system. And once we've built it, we don't need to pay to build it anymore. It divides into 3 categories: scaling, promotional pricing, and capacity building. And I'm following my script and I'm having some trouble. Here we are. So just to give you some context on this so-called system investment, scaling is the first sort of category, and we have managed to establish 4 service areas. The important thing to understand here is that the government is, we're helping the government of Uganda implement its new policy. And it's very clear that any service provider, any maintenance utility will need to operate at a large scale to be economically viable in order to recover costs. And recovering costs is essential to get some stability because dependency on ongoing subsidies in the long term will always weaken stability. So we know that in these clusters of 3 or 4 districts, there are about 1 million people. And if we reach about 1 million people with services, we can get costs down to reasonable levels that people can afford to pay in the form of maintenance fees and maintenance tariffs. So we, at the moment, we're at very early stages, 760 preventive maintenance agreements with communities. That's about 250,000 people we're servicing right now. It's still very small compared to the 4 million that's kind of potential of these 4 service areas. But nevertheless, it puts us in a position of helping the Ministry of Water here in Uganda to actually implement its policy and to get going. So what I'm going to do is go into the costs of that very quickly. Very quickly, of course, the main cost is strict performance indicators. We're going to keep functionality up to these very high levels that we've been consistently achieving in our 760 communities, above 96%, above 99% in many areas. We have some trouble with repair time in Karamoja, which we're resolving. And so you get a rough idea there from this slide what the performance demands are. And of course, it's expensive to achieve short repair times within 1 day and within 2 days. Now, on to costs. And I've only got 2 more slides, by the way, so we can look at costs. We're currently spending in some districts around $500 a year to maintain a hand pump. And I should say very quickly that we support 100% transformation of hand pumps to pipe systems. And we do build pipe systems. We're building one right now, but we've kind of stepped back because we've realized that the maintenance of pipe systems, isolated pipe systems, is even more of a challenge. And given the rising population and also hydrogeology constraints, they're actually going to be hand pumps. People are going to be dependent on hand pumps, millions of people, for many decades, unfortunately. So our organization basically maintains both the solar tap stand type of thing, pipe systems which are more convenient, and hand pumps. It maintains both. Now, what we've discovered through our very careful accounting on costs, that we can reduce costs to around $325 per year per water point if we increase volume. And as you can see in that slide, we really do need to go up to 1 million people or 4,000 hand pumps or some mixture of solar tap stands and hand pumps to get that cost down to that sort of level. That level is about $50 per month per household or slightly less, which is well within the UN guideline of 3% of rural income here in Uganda. It's actually below 2%, but there are problems around the cost of tariff collection, which will increase to 3%. These are compensated for, and I won't go into detail here, but they're compensated for by differentiated tariff systems, under which big communities subsidize small communities, which is common, of course, around the world. It's normal. Urban, subsidizes rural, and local business customers also. And we've developed systems for that differentiation. So we can kind of deal with the extra cost of tariff collection. Now, our maintenance agreement with these 760 communities already stipulate $325 per year, and people assign into that. But I should say, yes, we've now got a calculation on growth subsidy. I won't go into the next step, which is the next slide. Just looking at this subsidy, that pink triangle represents the cost in subsidy, which WASH funding organizations should be considering, in our view, what we call a growth subsidy. In order to reach these economic scales of service areas of about 1 million people, we can calculate, we can estimate around a cost of around 1.3 million. It's not very much, but it's only one service area to cover that growth subsidy, and over a period of 8 years, 9 years, which we think is achievable, practically achievable, even within current constraints. And that, of course, if you translate that to the whole country, where 30 million people need this, will probably be a bill of around 12 million in subsidy. We can go back to that in the questions. Now, finally, the last slide. How do we deal with willingness to pay, the usual problem? It's very clear that this tariff, projected economic tariff, or projected economic costs that we've worked out from our cost studies of around $325 a year, that translates to around $2,000. I didn't say that, but I think I implied that already. Affordable, socially affordable, politically acceptable tariff rate, and collection costs can be dealt with by differentiating tariffs. Now, we've got the ability to pay, frankly, and I think other studies have also, academic studies have also come to that conclusion. There is an ability to pay the full cost of service, not of investment, but of service. And that means that we're really dealing with the problem of willingness to pay. To solve that problem here, we have been introducing a discount system, and we found that some districts, some communities are willing to pay almost the full cost. We have one district where the rebate is only 15%, which is a rebate for fast payment in the first 3 months of the year of the full price. In some areas, we're only achieving around 30%, 35%, 40%, 50%. In some areas, we have subsidies from local government. Now, actually, I was completely wrong when I said that was the last slide. I was reading my thing. The cost of system building, I'll flash through this very fast. We have some very particular recommendations coming out of our research. The system components are the missing system components are basically good monitoring and evaluation at local level. Regulation, of course, is essential at central government level and even at regional level, and that's in place. The ministry has put that in place. But what is not in place is performance reviews for those stakeholders in the O&M framework, and facilitation, of proper performance auditing and monitoring, and really keeping people to task, because people are not necessarily following contracts unless they are coming to performance reviews regularly, 3 times a year, 4 times a year. So this includes the financing by donors of pre-works maintenance protocol, what I mentioned right at the beginning, the need for prior condition, that infrastructure investment is done with a maintenance arrangement as a prior condition. That needs funding, and M&E facilitator. So the recurrent costs, of course, are maintenance service and enabling service being the government's role, the local government's role, which of course can be assisted by donors to begin with and then handed over to local government. And the maintenance services up to high levels of functionality. So we've tried to summarize, we have summarized the conclusions of our 5 years with SWS in a paper. These are what's called 10 factors for viable service delivery. And there's a link available, I think, Finding Global Waters, or I can put it in the chat. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Rob. I was just going to summarize a few of the questions that we see in the chat. I know Rob has been going in and typing his responses as well. But I just wanted to summarize maybe some that hadn't been touched on in the chat. And then if we have time, Rob, maybe you can just mention some of the things that you'd responded in the chat as well. So one of the questions that came up was around the pay-as-you-fetch strategy and whether this was used for payment collection for maintenance services, and if so, were there any unintended consequences? So maybe I could direct that to Adam if you want to take that one.
Pranav, I'm so sorry. Can you repeat the question? I was just distracted for a moment there.
Yeah, no problem. The question was around pay-as-you-fetch as a strategy for payment collection, and if that was ever used by Wave in your case, and then if so, were there any unintended consequences of that?
And you know what, Pranav, I've still missed your question. Which strategy are you asking about? Which particular strategy for payment collection?
Pay as you fetch. So payment at the point of collection.
Okay, yes. Yes, we have a long story around that. Our analysis of, future stable, sustainable water supply delivery led to the conclusion, and it's in various papers we've written, waterline papers, in particular, a little bit in the 10 factors paper. The conclusion was that pay for volume, or pay as you fetch, is actually critically important because it means that the larger communities are subsidizing the smaller communities. And currently, socially acceptable subscription systems don't do that. They penalize smaller communities. So they're not the best thing. But so what we did was we went to one district, and I want to try and be as brief as possible, who understood this difference. And to our amazement, we gave them the option of pay for volume or subscription. They actually chose pay for volume. So we do have one district out of our 10 where we are operating a pay for volume system. However, the cost of collection is particularly severe. In the other districts where we're collecting bulk annual amounts and committees, by the way, we're still commended on good community committees, especially when they're led by women, they work very well. They collect more or less on a voluntary basis still as a public duty. And whereas with the pay for volume, we lost that voluntarism, and we found that there were very severe costs with, of course, attendance. So the only solution to that is technology. It is technically feasible to have hand pumps which automatically take your payment, debit it from a water credit on your card. And we've been working on that. And that's that's a few years away probably still, but it's a very important solution. So the answer is yes, pay for volume is important, but the practical application of it is still heavily constrained by the cost of collection.
Great, thanks, Adam. Rob, I wanted to maybe touch on some questions that you'd been responding in the chat, but for the other audience members who maybe haven't seen it, we had a couple of questions around the non-traditional donors, and are they donors versus investors, and if we think of them as investors, what incentives they have to invest, and is there a return on that investment in some way? And I know you've responded in the chat, but maybe you wanted to elaborate on that.
Yeah, sure, I'm happy to. I mean, I think they're really good questions, and certainly the trust fund that we set up in Kenya, and we have a Uptime cashless facility which is doing similar work at a larger scale. We were looking for non-donor funding, accepting that government and donors just wouldn't have sufficient budgets to pay for all of these things. Initially, as I think I was saying to Hannah, was the mining and the agricultural companies. This was largely corporate social responsibility, I would sort of say. They were coming in to sort of say, we like to support this, but it was less clear in terms of the outcome side, which has evolved over time in terms of giving them sort of data on uptime, the volumetric supply of water as well, and a number of other KPIs that have come into that. And that's refined our thinking. We've had bumps and bruises in the process of learning how you do this stuff. It's not clearly obvious to many of us, but it's been a lot of learning over the years. And recently with this ethical retailer in Germany that sells recyclable plastic bottles, I should say, to the German market, they've been interested in a matching fund which has advanced our work quite significantly. We're talking to other groups around this. So it's becoming more refined and more sophisticated as we go forward. And I think the concluding point is not everybody is looking for a financial return on investment. There are economic and social returns, and they are quite significant and can be applied to this, I think.
Great, thanks, Rob. I think, okay, it looks like we have about 2 more minutes. And so maybe just one quick question on the adaptability of these approaches. Are these maintenance approaches that have been applied in Uganda and Kenya very context specific, or do we see opportunities for these to be adapted and applied elsewhere? I'll let either one of you take that if you'd like.
my experience of Africa, and I have worked in probably 5 or 6 countries quite intensively in different sectors, mind you. But my experience is that these problems and these solutions we're talking about are common. There's very little difference in the problems faced in the different areas, but that's just my personal, I may be wrong.
Adam's never wrong. I'd echo that. I think there's what's been interesting for me working with Adam and the wider Uptime partners is that we are sort of seeing commonality approaches. There's variation, as you can see from some of the subsidy figures, but you certainly sort of see this ability to reliably supply water is heavily valued. And one of the horizons that we're all working to is then how do you bring safety and water quality metrics into this as we go forward.
Great. Thank you, Rob. And so for everyone else, I guess we will transition back to our Blue Jeans platform. Thank you again for all your questions in the chat, and those are being captured as well. So we'll find an opportunity to answer those after the session is complete. So we'll see everyone back in the Blue Jeans platform. And Katie has put a link to that down in our chat as well.